Some men don't raise their voices, they let the silence speak louder. Harrison Ford didn't walk into that hotel to make a scene. He came with a folded piece of paper and a question no one thought to answer. 1 hour later, the wine had dried on his jacket and a $3.8 billion future had vanished. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from today. And if this story makes you think twice about quiet strength, don't forget to subscribe. The chandelier in the Grand Etoile glowed like a constellation frozen in gold. Marble floors stretched beneath velvet ropes, polished to a mirror shine. Somewhere near the far end of the lobby, a pianist played a soft rendition of Clair de Lune, barely audible beneath the whisper of expensive heels and murmurs in French-accented English. This was the kind of place where billionaires arrived unannounced and were still greeted by name. A bellboy in white gloves held the door open as an elderly couple entered. He bowed. Their coats were taken. Luggage vanished onto carts. The man chuckled as the receptionist called him Monsieur Laval and welcomed him back. She leaned forward, hands folded neatly, and asked if they wanted the usual champagne sent up. 2 paces behind them, a man stepped into the lobby. He didn't look like he belonged there, not by their standards. Dust clung to his boots. His khaki jacket was faded at the seams, sleeves slightly frayed. A worn canvas cap sat low on his brow, and he carried a leather backpack over one shoulder, scratched, heavy, aged like something that had flown 1,000 miles and never asked for attention. He said nothing. He just stood in line behind the couple, waiting. The receptionist, Clarice, noticed him only when the couple walked away smiling. She straightened slightly, still holding her polite smile. But something about the man gave her pause. He looked older, weathered, but there was something in the way he stood, still, like the center of a storm that didn't need to move to be felt. "Bonjour, monsieur," Clarice said gently. "How may I assist you?" The man reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a small piece of paper. He laid it on the counter, a printed voucher, paper creased down the center. The Grand Etoile logo glimmered faintly in the top right corner. "I'd like to book a room," he said. His voice was calm, deep. It had weight but no demand. Clarice looked at the voucher. It was valid. A rare promotional offer distributed through the hotel's historical preservation program. She hesitated, scanning it again. And then the voice came. "Clarice," a man snapped. "Step aside." From behind the floral centerpiece near the concierge desk came a tall figure in a charcoal gray suit. Maurice Delicourt, hotel manager, mid-50s. Angular frame, silver hair slicked with precision. He moved with the confidence of someone who owned everything his shoes touched. He approached without looking at the guest. "Only the voucher." "What's this?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Clarice started to speak, but Maurice held up a hand. "We don't honor promotional walk-ins," he said sharply. "Not at this property." The man didn't move. "It's a valid voucher." Maurice looked at him for the first time. His eyes traveled from the dusty boots to the cap. His lips curled slightly. "This is not a roadside inn," he said. "We have standards." Still, the man said nothing, just looked at him, quiet, unshaken. Maurice plucked the voucher off the counter, held it between 2 fingers like something unclean, and then, without a blink, tore it neatly in half. The sound cracked across the marble lobby like a whip. Clarice gasped. Someone nearby looked over. "I suggest," Maurice said, voice low and clipped, "you try a motel on the outskirts. Grand Etoile is reserved for serious clients." The man's eyes didn't narrow, his mouth didn't move, but something shifted behind the stillness, not anger, just distance. He reached down, picked up the torn pieces, folded them gently, and placed them back into his pocket. Then he looked Maurice directly in the eye. "It's real," he said, "but maybe you don't see real things anymore." Maurice blinked, caught off guard by the quiet weight of it. The man turned, no fuss, no threat, just a slight nod to Clarice, not of thanks but of recognition, and then he walked toward the exit, the sound of his boots trailing off beneath the chandelier's glow. The golden doors of the Grand Etoile swung open with a soft breath of wind as Harrison Ford stepped back into the late afternoon light. He didn't look back. The torn voucher was still in his pocket, folded neatly. Behind him, the hush of the marble lobby began to shift, turning into something else. Murmurs, whispers, laughter. Someone near the entrance leaned toward a friend. "Did you see that? They actually kicked him out." A woman in a designer coat held up her phone, already recording. Another voice, "Wait, is that? No, can't be. Why would he be here?" Inside, the piano had stopped. Maurice remained near the front desk, arms crossed, watching Harrison's retreating figure with a smug set to his jaw. Security arrived, 2 men in pressed black suits, earbuds in place. They didn't speak, just looked to Maurice. He waved a dismissive hand. "Escort him away from the premises, make sure he doesn't linger." The guard stepped forward, crossing the threshold as Harrison reached the top of the hotel's front steps, and then timing or chance, a silver tray emerged from the side corridor. On it, 2 crystal glasses of Burgundy wine. The waiter was young, maybe 22, crisp white apron, name tag that read Hugo. He wasn't part of what was happening. Just doing his job, delivering a tray. Morris saw it first, and before Hugo could even react, Morris stepped toward him, snatched one of the glasses in a single fluid motion and turned. The wine flew. It hit Harrison full on the chest. A deep splash of red against the pale gray of his worn jacket. Liquid streaked downward in slow, deliberate rivulets. For a second, no one moved. No one breathed. Then came the laughter. It started small. One man near the concierge desk chuckled. A woman by the flower arrangement giggled behind her hand. Phones lifted. Record buttons glowed red. Somewhere in the blur of whispers, someone said, "That's what you get for pretending." Morris didn't even look ashamed. If anything, he seemed pleased. He stepped back, brushing invisible lint from his sleeve, nodding to the security team. Clara stood behind the front desk, frozen. Her hands trembled just slightly. She took one step forward, eyes wide, mouth parting as if to say something, then stopped. Her gaze flicked to Morris, then to the guests watching. She stepped back, folded her hands, silent. Harrison didn't flinch. He didn't shout, didn't wipe at the wine. He simply glanced down, watching the stain blossom like an ink spill over time-worn fabric. Then, with a motion so slow it was almost ceremonial, he lifted one hand and flicked his jacket sleeve just once, like brushing away a speck of dust. The guards moved in closer, flanking him. One gestured toward the street. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you," but Harrison had already started walking, past the guards, past the onlookers, past Hugo, who stood frozen with the now half-empty tray in his hands. The waiter looked at the man walking away and then looked down at the red-streaked glass still on the tray. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The doors of Grand Etoile remained wide open, framing Harrison's figure as he stepped into the fading light. He didn't hurry, he didn't turn around. His jacket clung wet to his shoulders, wine dripping onto the stone steps. But he moved as if it didn't matter, as if none of it had touched him at all. From the mezzanine above, someone called out mockingly, "Need a cab, old man? Uber too expensive these days." More laughter. Clarice turned her head away. Outside, Harrison reached the sidewalk. He adjusted the strap of his backpack across his shoulder. The glass towers of Geneva caught the last amber rays of sun, gleaming like everything was still right in the world. He paused just for a moment, then walked on. No words, no reaction, only silence, the kind that lingered longer than anyone expected. On the 34th floor of the Grand Etoile, the walls were glass and the silence was sharp. The boardroom stretched across the west wing, its long obsidian table untouched, chairs still perfectly aligned. But Elena Russo wasn't in the boardroom. She stood alone in her office, eyes fixed on the surveillance monitor embedded into her sleek walnut desk. The footage had no sound, just a wide-angle feed from the lobby. She watched as a man in a faded cap stepped up to the counter, watched Clarice take the voucher, watched Morris appear. She didn't blink when he tore it, but her breath caught when she saw what came next. The wine! It splashed across his chest like a crimson wound. The man didn't move, just flicked his sleeve. Elena leaned forward, pausing the video at that exact frame. The still image showed him mid-turn, profile sharp, jaw set, eyes unreadable. It was all there, the posture, the silence, the way he carried himself like someone who had stood through storms far greater than this one. Her assistant, Thierry, stood nearby, nervously shifting from foot to foot. "Madame Russo," he said quietly. "That man, wasn't he?" "Yes," she cut in. Thierry's voice dropped. "That's Harrison Ford." Elena didn't nod, she just stared at the screen. "I thought he was arriving tomorrow." "Private name, no press, no handlers. He was," Elena said. "That was the arrangement, so why is he here now?" She sat down slowly, folding her hands together on the desk. "He came early, no escort, no briefing, just walked in. Testing the waters." Thierry frowned. "Testing?" She looked at him. "You've heard the stories, haven't you?" Thierry hesitated. "The rumors about what happened in Prague or Seoul?" "Exactly. In Prague he dressed as a janitor. In Seoul he spent 2 days walking the staff entrance, just observing. The companies thought it was a prank until they lost everything." Thierry exhaled. "You think this was another test?" She didn't answer. Didn't have to. Her gaze returned to the screen. The man who had been shoved out of their hotel wasn't a stranger. He was the reason they were still afloat. The Falcon Ridge Capital Deal 3, €8 billion in expansion funding, tied directly to one man's final signature. And that man had just been humiliated on the front steps like a trespasser. Thierry cleared his throat. "Morris didn't know?" "No," Elena said flatly. "He didn't ask." "That's worse." The room went quiet. Outside, the sun dipped lower behind the mountains, casting long gold shadows across the lake. Geneva glittered in the distance like nothing had happened. But everything had. A knock sounded at her door. Thierry moved to open it but paused as the intercom buzzed. Madame Rousseau, Maurice Delacourt is requesting an urgent meeting. Elena didn't move. She reached forward and pressed pause on the video again. Harrison's face froze in time, wine staining his jacket, eyes level, unwavering. "Tell Mr. Delacourt," she said, "I'm in a meeting." Thierry blinked. "With who?" Elena's voice dropped to something colder than the view outside. "With a man the world thought they recognized, until they didn't. And now we wait." The boardroom on the 35th floor was colder than usual, not in temperature, in tension. 12 leather chairs lined the glass walls, overlooking a lake that shimmered beneath a fading Swiss sky. At the head of the long obsidian table sat executives in tailored suits, fingers drumming, eyes darting. No one spoke. Not really. A cough here, a sigh there. The silence was not empty, it was waiting. Maurice Delacourt sat nearest the door, face pale, hands clenched around a silk handkerchief that had long since failed to stop the sweat. He hadn't spoken in 10 minutes. He couldn't. His last words to the man he thought was a vagrant still echoed in his own ears. "This place isn't for people like you." No one had corrected him, not then. And now they waited. Elena Rousseau sat at the far end, calm but unreadable. She'd said 3 words when they gathered. "He's coming in." Since then, nothing. The elevator chimed. The mirrored doors opened, and Harrison Ford stepped into the room, not in a dusty jacket, not in boots caked with the road. He wore a charcoal gray suit, crisp white shirt, dark tie, no pocket square, no lapel pin, just simplicity. His shoes were clean, his posture straight, but over one shoulder still was the same weathered leather backpack. He walked slowly, deliberately, as if the room wasn't full of men who had once laughed at him. He placed the backpack gently on the table. No one moved, no one breathed. Elena stood. "Gentlemen," she said, "allow me to introduce Mr. Harrison Ford, CEO of Falcon Ridge Capital." It was like a fault line cracked down the middle of the room. Someone muttered, "Falcon Ridge, the investment group, the expansion fund, the 8 billion. Morris stood too fast. His chair tipped. I didn't know," he stammered. "No one told me." If I had. Harrison looked at him, not with rage, not even with disdain, just that same stillness, the same quiet weight. "No one had to," he said. Morris froze. His mouth opened, closed again. "You didn't bother to ask," Harrison continued. "You saw a man walk in, a man with a coupon, and that was enough." He turned now, addressing the room. "You judged him in 5 seconds, his shoes, his coat. You decided who he was before he spoke. That tells me everything I need to know." Another executive shifted uncomfortably. One cleared his throat as if to speak, then thought better of it. Harrison's voice remained calm, but it cut like ice. "This deal," he said, "is not about spreadsheets. It's not about projections or growth models. It's about people." He paused, "and this company has failed that test." Morris stepped forward, almost desperate now. "Mr. Ford, please, it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. If you'll allow us to correct." "No." The word stopped, the air cold. Harrison didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I believe in second chances," he said, "but not for those who choose cruelty first." He looked around the table once more. "You don't build legacy by stepping on the quiet man at the door. You build it by noticing him." He picked up his backpack. "Falcon Ridge is withdrawing its full financial commitment from Grand Etoile, effective immediately." He turned toward the elevator. The room remained frozen. Morris's voice broke through at the last moment, hoarse and trembling. "You can't. That deal saves us." Harrison stopped. "Just once. Then you should have saved yourselves," he said. And with that he walked out. No anger, no drama, just the soft click of shoes on polished stone. The doors slid closed behind him. No one followed. No one dared. The silence he left behind rang louder than any punishment they could have imagined. The lobby of the Grand Etoile no longer whispered. It roared. By 4 o'clock, the marble floors were covered in cables and camera tripods. Journalists packed shoulder to shoulder beneath the crystal chandelier. The velvet ropes that once divided guests from staff were gone, replaced by flashing lights and microphones in every direction. The air was thick with anticipation, with something close to panic. At the center stood a podium. Harrison Ford approached it without escort. No one announced him. He didn't wear a pinstripe suit or silk tie, just a black jacket, open collar, and the same quiet stillness that had carried him through everything else. Elena Rousseau walked beside him, then stepped back. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Reporters surged forward. "Mr. Ford, is it true you were denied entry? Is Falcon Ridge pulling out of the investment? Are you here for a statement or revenge?" He raised one hand, not to hush them, but to steady the room. "Good afternoon," he said. "My name is Harrison Ford." Cameras clicked. Lights flared. "I'm not here as an actor. I'm not here as a CEO. I came to this building anonymously to see how you treat the man without the title. He paused, not dramatically, just enough for the weight to land. I carried a valid voucher issued by this very hotel. I asked for nothing more than a room. His voice didn't rise, it didn't falter, it remained steady, unshakable. In return, I was dismissed, marked, thrown out. He glanced toward the far end of the lobby. Morris stood there, near the wall, pale and still. That kind of treatment doesn't offend me personally, but it tells me everything about a culture and what kind of future it's building. A murmur passed through the crowd. Some nodded, others scribbled notes. No one laughed now. This morning, Falcon Ridge Capital terminated its full financial commitment to the Grand Etoile Group. Effective immediately, the room erupted. Reporters shouted questions over one another. Will this impact other investments? Is this a public boycott? Are you taking legal action? But Harrison didn't flinch. I'm not interested in destroying companies, he said. I'm interested in revealing them, in reminding all of us, especially those with power, that the quietest person in the room still matters. Morris broke from the wall. He pushed forward, brushing past cameras until he reached the edge of the podium. His face was drawn, his voice cracked. Mr. Ford, please, I didn't know. It wasn't meant to be personal. If I could take it back, you can't, Harrison said, looking at him. His tone was level, not unkind, but final. Morris tried again. I made a mistake. We all do, Harrison said. I believe in second chances. Morris's eyes flickered with hope, but not for people who make cruelty their first instinct. Silence. Not one flashbulb went off. Not one reporter moved. Harrison looked out at the crowd, at the cameras, at the world watching through every screen. This isn't about one hotel, he said. It's about how we treat the person with no name, no suit, no spotlight. And then he stepped back from the podium. No applause, no farewell. He simply turned and walked away. Elena followed a step behind. No security detail, no press handler. Just the sound of shoes on stone and the echo of a truth no one could unhear. Behind him, Morris stood motionless, the microphone still trembling in his hand. But no one was listening to him anymore. By morning, the Grand Etoile wasn't trending for its 5-star menus or lakefront views. It was trending for a video, multiple angles, shaky phone clips, lobby security footage leaked from somewhere deep inside. They all showed the same thing: a man in a cap, a voucher torn in half, a glass of red wine hurled like a weapon, and the stillness that followed. One clip filmed by a guest from the mezzanine passed 50 million views before sunrise. On social media, the hotel's name had changed. It was no longer a destination. It was a lesson, a symbol. Hashtags swirled with phrases like "dignity isn't luxury" and "the man with the backpack." Celebrities weighed in. Investors panicked. Inside the headquarters of the Etoile Group, phones rang without pause. Emails poured in faster than they could be opened. Emergency board meetings were called. Cancelled, then called again. Executives shouted across glass-walled offices as stock tickers glitched on monitors behind them. The price fell 17% in the first hour, then another 12%, and it kept falling. No one said Harrison Ford's name aloud, but everyone knew, and every employee who had walked past him that day without seeing him now wondered what it had cost. Morris didn't show up. His office door remained closed, lights off, no word. But one person couldn't stay silent. Clarice sat on the edge of her bed, still in uniform, her name tag in her palm. She stared at it for a long time. Then she got up, buttoned her coat, and walked out the door. She found him in the park, not far from the hotel, sitting on a wooden bench facing the lake. Wind moved across the water in quiet ripples. He didn't have a phone out. He wasn't watching the storm unfold online. He just sat there. One leg crossed over the other, elbows resting on his knees. Clarice approached slowly, unsure if he'd recognize her, unsure what she'd even say. He looked up before she spoke. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out 2 small torn pieces of paper, folded gently, kept safe. I kept these, she said. He didn't take them right away, just watched her. I didn't do the right thing that day, she said. I just watched it happen. Her voice cracked at the edges. She looked down at her hands. I wanted to help, but I was afraid. I didn't want to lose my job. Silence. Not a heavy one, not the kind that punishes, just space. Finally, he took the pieces from her hand. Thank you, he said. That's all. She met his eyes, expecting judgment, but there wasn't any. You didn't add to the damage, he said. That's more than most. She exhaled. Some weight left her shoulders, not all of it, but enough to stand taller. I've never met someone who tested people like this, she said. Why not just walk in like you did today? Announce who you are. Because who I am shouldn't matter, he said. How people behave when they think you're no one, that's the part that does. Clarice nodded. Her fingers curled around her coat buttons, holding them like they might keep her together. She turned to go, then stopped. For what it's worth, she said, I hope they never rebuild that lobby the same way. He didn't answer, but the corner of his mouth lifted, almost a smile. As she walked away, the wind picked up off the lake. The markets were still crashing. The company was still unraveling. But somewhere in that moment, something small had shifted, and it was enough. 1 month later, the golden letters that once spelled Grand Etoile had been taken down. In their place was a matte black plaque, simple, unpolished, quietly affixed above the entrance. It read, "The Amelia Center. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, no camera crews, no press releases. Just a new name for an old building, and a silence that felt different this time earned." Inside, the chandeliers were gone, the marble counters replaced by warm oak desks. The velvet ropes had vanished, and in their place, families moved freely. Children laughed down hallways once reserved for luxury. Veterans sat in the sunroom. Single mothers filled out school forms beside fresh coffee machines. There was no scent of wealth in the air, just life. Harrison Ford stood in the main corridor, hands in his pockets, watching a little boy race down the length of the floor with a toy airplane in hand. He wasn't here to be seen, he never was. But today he had brought someone with him. The boy slowed, jogging back to Ford's side. He was 7, quiet, thin, wearing shoes a size too big. Ford walked beside him, slow and steady. "That's the dining hall now," Harrison said, nodding toward the former ballroom. "And over there. That used to be the cigar lounge. Now it's a reading room." The boy looked up, eyes wide. "All of this was yours?" "No," Ford said. "It's yours now." They walked a little farther until they reached the west wall of the lobby. There, beneath soft lighting, hung a single frame. Inside it, behind glass, were 2 torn halves of a paper voucher, the edges still ragged, the ink faded. A small plaque beneath read, "Dignity doesn't expire." The boy stared at it. "What is it?" he asked. Ford was quiet for a long moment. That, he said, was the moment everything changed. Behind them, Elena Russo approached, holding a clipboard. She didn't interrupt, just waited. Ford turned to her. "Is everything running?" "Yes," she said. 60 permanent housing units, a medical center, classrooms on the 3rd floor. A trauma support wing opens next month. We're funded for at least 20 years. All operational costs are covered through the foundation." He nodded once. "No investors, no, just you." He looked around at the lobby, at the scuff-proof rubber tiles, the soft lighting, the smell of warm bread from the new cafeteria kitchen. "It feels better now," he said. Elena smiled faintly. "We had a developer call last week. Offered to buy back the building, triple market value." Ford didn't even look at her. "Let them keep their offers." She hesitated. "Why this building, though? Why not start fresh somewhere else?" Ford took a breath. His voice dropped. "Because this is where it happened." She nodded, understood. They began to walk again, but the boy tugged Ford's sleeve. "Why is it called the Amelia Center?" Ford looked down. "A long time ago. There was a girl named Amelia. She was trapped in a canyon during a storm. No rescue team could get to her, so I flew in, just me, an old helicopter, and enough stubbornness to get it done." "Did you save her?" Ford nodded. "She was 11. She made it out. She went on to teach science to kids who thought no one saw them." The boy thought about that. "Is she still around?" Ford looked at the glass doors. "No, but what she left behind is outside." The sun was beginning to set over the mountains. Light streamed in through the tall windows. Upstairs, laughter echoed from the children's classrooms. Ford stood still just for a moment, watching the reflection of the boy beside him in the glass. A reflection of someone who might one day forget the stain but never forget the lesson. He didn't stay long. He never did. Just a quiet man in a quiet building. No fanfare, no revenge, only restoration. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.